The wolf wouldn't stop howling, and Sarah Dunmore couldn't figure out if it was warning her or calling her home. She'd heard it first somewhere around mile 4, after her truck had gone sideways in the ditch off Highway 16, and she'd started walking north through the spruce because the map on her cracked phone said there was something up there, a property, a name, a way out of the snowstorm that was closing the sky down like a lid. The wolf stopped when she reached the fence. She kept walking. The property didn't look like much from the outside. A gate hanging crooked, boards warped from years of freeze and thaw, the name Drummond burned into a plank so faded it was more ghost than letters. But the light in the window was real, yellow and steady, and Sarah had been walking in wet boots for 2 hours, with her ribs still aching from the crash, so she pushed the gate open and knocked. The man who answered held a lantern in one hand, and a pointed look on his face that was worse than any rifle. "You're bleeding," he said. Sarah touched her temple. Her fingers came back dark. She hadn't realized. "I had an accident on the highway," she said. "My truck's in the ditch. I need to use a phone." His name was Drummond. He told her that when he finally stepped aside, James Drummond, and he'd lived on this land outside Smithers since before she was born by the look of him, 50-something, with the kind of stillness that only comes from being alone a long time. The house was warm and smelled like wood smoke and pine pitch and something cooking on the stove that her stomach responded to before she'd even taken off her coat. He didn't ask why she was on Highway 16 in a snowstorm in late November with no winter tires and a bag that was too small for anything permanent and too large for just a day trip. He just put a cloth against her temple and held it there while she called the tow company and listened to the automated message that said all lines were busy due to storm volume. Please hold or call back later. "The road'll be closed by morning," James said when she hung up. "Storm's coming in from the coast." Sarah looked at the window. The snow was moving sideways now. "I have somewhere to be," she said. He didn't ask where. He just said, "The couch is there," and went back to the stove. She almost left anyway. Stood at the door for a full minute with her hand on the latch, telling herself she didn't take charity, didn't take anything from strangers, didn't put herself in situations where she owed people she didn't know. That was the rule she'd built after Daniel, after the kind man with the patient eyes who'd turned out to be something else entirely. She had a whole architecture of rules now, carefully maintained, and chief among them was, don't stay. But the snow kept coming, and her ribs kept aching, and somewhere in the field behind the house, a sound reached her through the wall, low and labored, an animal in distress. Sarah had grown up on her uncle's property outside Fort St. James. She knew that sound. She put her bag down and went out the back door. The barn was 30 feet from the house, old but solid, the kind of structure that had been repaired so many times it was more repair than original. Inside, 3 horses stood in separate stalls, and a 4th was down, lying on her side in the far corner, with her legs moving weakly, like she was trying to stand and couldn't remember how. Sarah crouched beside her without thinking. The mare was a dark bay, and her eyes were too still. Fever. Sarah pressed her palm flat against the horse's neck and felt the heat radiating up like the ground after a long summer. "She's been like that since yesterday." James stood in the doorway. He sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Vet's coming from Terrace, but the road's closed. My other horses are starting to show the same thing." Sarah moved her hands along the mare's flank. Her uncle had taught her this. The way you listen with your hands when an animal can't tell you what's wrong. He'd said it wasn't anything special, just attention. Paying the kind of attention most people were too busy or too impatient to give. "When did they last drink from the creek?" she asked. James was quiet for a moment. "How'd you know it was the creek?" "The smell and her belly." Sarah sat back on her heels. "There's a sourness to runoff contamination that's different from a gut problem. What's upstream from you?" He took longer to answer this time. "Old copper works. Been decommissioned 20 years. But the spring melt brings something down every year. I've been fencing it off, but the south section came down in the October freeze." Sarah stood. "You need to get them off that water. Tonight, not tomorrow. And there's something you can do for the fever while we wait for the vet. If you've got charcoal and apple cider vinegar." James looked at her for a long moment. "I've got both," he said. They worked through the night. Sarah didn't think about Daniel. Didn't think about the envelope in her bag with her aunt's address on it, the plan she'd been driving toward before the ditch. She just worked, and James worked beside her, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, the bay mare got to her feet. James stood there and watched the horse stand, and he didn't say anything for a long time. "Who are you?" he finally asked. "Sarah Dunmore." She wiped her hands on her jeans. I was a vet tech for 4 years before. He didn't ask what before meant. He handed her a coffee instead. She stayed 2 more days because the storm didn't lift and the vet still couldn't get through, and 2 of the other horses started showing symptoms. By the 3rd day, she'd earned her keep, and then some. By the end of the week, James had offered her a job. Not out of pity, she could see the difference. It was the same look her uncle used to give her when she did something right. Acknowledgement. Plain and simple. Room and board plus wages, James said. I need someone who knows animals. The last hand I had left in September. I don't do permanent, Sarah said. I'm not asking for permanent. I'm asking for this winter. She said yes before she'd made the conscious decision to say it, which should have alarmed her more than it did. The first weeks were work and nothing else, which suited her. James was not a talkative man. He gave instructions once, concisely, and expected them followed. He didn't hover. He didn't ask questions. He had a daughter in Prince George who called on Sundays, and a photograph of a woman on the mantel who'd clearly been beautiful and was clearly gone, and he never talked about either of those things. The other ranchers in the valley were slower to warm up. The man at the feed store in Smithers, a wide-shouldered person named Frank Holt, gave her the particular look that men like Frank gave women who showed up in places they weren't expected. Polite on the surface, measuring underneath. A woman at the church social, someone's wife in expensive boots, asked James how he'd found her and didn't address Sarah directly while doing it. People talk, James told her when they drove home. I noticed. Doesn't bother you? Sarah looked out the window at the spruce going dark in the early dusk. I've had worse than talk. He didn't ask. She appreciated that. What she didn't anticipate was Holt's sister. Renata Holt arrived at the ranch on a Thursday in December in a truck that cost more than the barn, wearing the kind of casual clothes that are designed to look effortless and don't. She was 40, maybe 42, with the confident carriage of someone who's never had to doubt whether they belong in a room. She was also, James explained flatly, when she called ahead, the woman who'd been trying to buy his property for the past 3 years. Her father wants the land, James said. She's been handling the negotiation. What does she want with a cattle ranch? Pipeline easement, the land's in the right corridor, worth 3 times what it looks like on paper. Renata shook Sarah's hand when they met, and smiled with all the warmth of someone who had learned how to smile. I've heard so much about you, she said, though they'd never spoken. That evening, Sarah found James on the porch in the dark, not looking at anything particular. She's going to be a problem, Sir said. She's always a problem. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Since Rachel died, Renata's had a theory that I'm not managing well enough to hold this place. Every time she hears something she can use, she brings it to her father, and they tighten the screws a little more. The bank loan, the supply account, small things. Sarah sat down on the step below him. The temperature was dropping, and she could see her breath. And now she hears you've hired some woman off the highway with no references and no history, Sarah said. That's about right. Am I making things harder for you? James looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation. You saved my horses. You're fixing my south fence. You've learned every piece of equipment on this property in 6 weeks. I'd hire you 10 times over. Sarah let that settle. She wasn't used to being told she'd earned something without a condition attached to it. Renata's first move came the following week. Sarah heard about it from Frank Holt himself, who seemed uncomfortable delivering the news and delivered it anyway. Renata had been asking around town about Sarah, about where she'd come from and why she'd left, and whether anyone had actually verified her credentials. She'd found out about Daniel, how Sarah didn't know, but money had ways, and she'd been telling people the version that made Sarah look careless and grasping and naive, the version that was easiest to believe about a woman alone. Daniel Prentice had been a land developer out of Vancouver. He'd come to Fort St. James with an investor presentation and a plan to turn her uncle's property into a resort development. Her uncle was sick by then. The paperwork Sarah had signed, trusting Daniel's word about what it meant, had transferred enough rights to make the development possible. By the time her uncle understood what had happened, Daniel was gone, and the property was tied up in legal challenges that had cost what was left of her uncle's savings. She'd spent 2 years thinking it was her fault, that she should have read more carefully, asked more questions, trusted less. The town had thought so too. A woman her age should have known better. Shouldn't have trusted a man like that. Should have been suspicious. She'd eventually stopped arguing with that verdict and just left. Gone north, kept moving. Why are you telling me this? Sarah asked Frank. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. Because my sister is going to use it to go after Drummond. And whatever else she is, she's my sister. And I thought you should know before it got bad. Sarah thanked him, drove back to the ranch in silence, sat in the truck for 10 minutes before going inside. James was at the kitchen table with the ranch account spread out in front of him, and the look of a man doing mathematics that don't add up. He looked up when she came in. Renata's been asking about my past, Sarah said. She found something. She's going to try to use it. He waited. Sarah told him about Daniel, all of it. The whole flat, honest version, without softening what she'd done wrong or exaggerating what had been done to her. She'd learned that the edited version always came back worse. James listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Does it change how the horses are doing? He said. Sarah blinked. What? Does it change the fact that my herd is healthy because of you? Does it change the south fence or the water line you rerouted or the inventory you reorganized in October? His voice was level, because if it doesn't, I don't see that it changes anything here. Sarah had been ready for a lot of things, not that. It might give Renata something to work with, she said. Let her work with it. She's been trying to take this land since before you showed up. You're not the reason she's a problem. But the problem got worse. Renata had connections that reached further than the feed store. By mid-January, the banker who held James's operating loan called requesting an early review. 2 of the suppliers James used started asking for payment up front instead of extending their usual credit. Small pressures, but accumulating. The kind of thing designed to tire a person out. Sarah saw the accounts, saw what it was adding up to. And then one morning in late January, she drove into Smithers for feed and came back to find an unfamiliar truck at the ranch, and 2 men she'd never seen talking to James in the yard. They left before she could get out of her own truck. James stood there watching them go, with an expression she'd learned to read as controlled anger. Renata's father's people, he said. They want to set up a formal meeting, make an offer on the property. His jaw tightened. They're saying the bank loan may not be renewed in spring without additional security. Sarah looked at the road where the truck had gone. They can do that? Renata's father owns 12% of that bank. He turned toward the barn. So yes. That night, Sarah lay awake in the small room off the kitchen, and did what she'd been trying not to do for weeks. She did the math on what happened if she left. If she quietly disappeared, removed herself from the equation, stopped being the thing Renata pointed to when she told her story about James making bad decisions. It would make things simpler for him. She could see the logic. She could also see where that logic ended. She'd run that calculation before. She'd left Fort St. James telling herself it was better for everyone, and she'd spent a year moving around BC sleeping badly and waking up angry. Running didn't fix what had been broken. It just moved the location of the wound. She got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table until James came down at 5. I want to know what evidence there is against the bank pressure, she said when he came in. He stopped, looked at her. Renata has to be coordinating through her father's business somehow, Sarah said. That's money moving, accounts, communications. If she approached the bank on your loan, there'll be a record. That's not easy to get. No, but your lawyer can request it. And if there's a paper trail showing the loan review was triggered by outside pressure rather than your financial standing, that's interference. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. It's not nothing. James sat down across from her. He looked tired, but something else too. Less alone, maybe. You're not leaving, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Not because of her, Sarah said. The lawyer was a woman named Constance Webb out of Prince George, who specialized in resource rights and had a particular dislike of land consolidation tactics that she expressed with technical precision and a very flat voice. James drove to see her in February, and Sarah stayed at the ranch and fixed 3 sections of the east fence in temperatures that kept dropping. Constance found the thread within 2 weeks. The loan review request hadn't come from the bank's own risk assessment. It had come through a letter drafted by Renata's father's company, citing concerns about management stability. Language that connected, through a careful chain of meetings and phone calls, directly to the rumors Renata had been spreading in town. It was enough to file a formal complaint. Not enough on its own to stop everything, but enough to make noise. Constance suggested going to the regional paper. James didn't want to. He'd spent his whole life in this valley and wasn't built for that kind of exposure. Sarah didn't push. She'd learned something about people who'd been quiet for a long time. Forcing them public before they were ready was its own kind of violence. What she didn't expect was for the story to get out anyway. Frank Holt came to see her in early March. He sat in his truck at the end of the lane for 5 minutes before getting out, which she clocked from the barn, and when he came in, he looked like a man who'd decided something at a cost to himself. Renata asked me to back her account of you, he said. Said she'd need people from town to confirm you were someone James should have known better than to trust. He turned his hat in his hands. I told her no. Sarah waited. She also asked me to write something down for her lawyer. About your past, about the property in Fort St. James. He looked up. I told her I wouldn't. What happened to you there wasn't your fault, and I know it because I knew Daniel Prentice 20 years ago, and I know exactly how he operates. A pause. I should have said something sooner, before she got this far. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then, why are you telling me now? Because Renata is going to the bank board directly next week, and Constance Webb is good, but she needs people willing to go on record, and I'm willing. Frank set his hat on the workbench. I don't agree with what my sister is doing. I never did. I just didn't want to be in the middle of it. He looked at the horses in the stalls. Staying out of it turned out to be the same as taking her side. I should have known that earlier. Sarah thought about a lot of things in the seconds after that. About her uncle. About the people in Fort St. James who'd known something was wrong and stayed quiet. About the calculation she'd made herself. The one where leaving felt like protecting people. Thank you, she said. She told James that evening. He listened the same way he listened to everything, completely still, taking it in. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment longer than usual. That's going to make a difference, he said. Might. It will. He looked at her. Something in his face had shifted slightly over the months, opened up by some degree that was easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. She'd been paying attention, Sarah. She waited. I know you said this was just for the winter. It was. Spring's in 3 weeks. The fire crackled. Outside, the temperature had finally started to ease. She'd heard geese 2 days ago, the first of them coming north. I know, she said. He didn't press. That was one of the things she'd learned about James Drummond. He didn't press. He said what was true and let the other person decide what to do with it. She'd thought at first it was distance, but she'd come to understand it was the opposite. It was a kind of respect she hadn't encountered much. The east pasture needs reseeding in April, she said, and you still haven't fixed the north gate properly. You've been putting that off since October. James looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to it. Suppose I have, he said. The bank board met in the 3rd week of March. Constance Webb presented the documentation. Frank Holt gave a statement. 2 other ranchers from the valley, who'd had their own run-ins with Renata's father's land strategies, showed up because Constance had asked, and they'd decided they were tired of staying quiet. Renata sat through it with the expression of a person who has not previously been told no in any binding way. Her lawyer tried to reframe twice. The board chair, a cautious woman who cared more about her institution's liability than anyone's personal agenda, asked Renata's father's company to respond in writing to the interference allegation within 30 days. It was not a victory exactly. It was more like the beginning of a fair fight, which was different from what they'd had before. The loan review was suspended pending the response. The suppliers came back to normal terms within 2 weeks after word got around. Renata left town. She didn't say goodbye to anyone, as far as Sarah heard. Spring came the way it comes in that part of BC, fast and loud, the creek running high and muddy, the spruce getting that new green look that made the hills seem to breathe. The horses were all healthy. The bay mare who'd been lying on her side the night Sarah arrived was out in the east pasture with her head up, moving through the grass like nothing had ever been wrong. James found Sarah standing at the fence watching her one morning. You know, he said, coming to stand beside her, when I answered the door that night, I almost didn't. Sarah glanced at him. I'd had 3 people that week try to sell me things, he said. I was tired of strangers. I almost let it knock a second time and go away. What made you answer? He was quiet for a moment. Didn't seem right not to. He looked at the mare in the pasture. Rachel used to say I had a bad habit of doing things just because they were right, even when they were inconvenient. Said it was going to get me into trouble someday. A pause. I think she meant it as a warning. Didn't take it that way. Sarah thought about the night she'd stood with her hand on his door latch, about the wolf she'd heard on the highway that seemed to stop exactly when she reached the gate. I almost didn't stay either, she said. I was going to leave as soon as the storm cleared. What stopped you? Your horse. She smiled slightly. And the fact that you didn't ask me to explain myself. He nodded slowly. Morning light was coming across the pasture at a low angle, the way it does in March when the season is turning, and the bay mare was standing perfectly still in the middle of it, like she was aware of something. I'm not asking you to stay, James said. I want to be clear about that. If you have somewhere to go, I'm not going to make that harder. I know you're not. But, he turned to look at her. His face was the way it always was. Not easy to read but honest underneath when you knew how to look. If you don't have somewhere you need to be, if this has become a place that means something to you. He stopped, started again more carefully. I'd rather you stay. Not because of the fence or the horses. Because I've gotten used to you being here, and I think that matters. Sarah had heard words like that before. She'd heard them from Daniel, polished and fluent, and specifically designed to land in the place where her defenses were lowest. She knew the difference. She knew what performed warmth felt like, and she knew what this felt like. This felt like a man who'd thought carefully before speaking and said exactly what he meant without decoration. I'm not easy to be around, she said. I wake up angry sometimes. I don't talk about things when I should. I make decisions alone that I should probably run by people. I know, James said. I've been watching you do it for 4 months. Sarah laughed, which surprised her. It came out genuine and caught her slightly off guard, the way real laughter does. Okay, she said. Okay, you'll stay. Okay, I'll stay. They stood at the fence for a while longer. The mare moved off toward the tree line. Somewhere behind them, a woodpecker started up in the spruce, loud and determined, doing the work of the season. Sarah thought about Fort St. James, about the woman she'd been when she left, smaller somehow, even though she'd thought at the time she was being practical. Thought about the drive north, and the ditch and the door she'd almost not knocked on. She didn't think, as she sometimes had before, that things happened for a reason. She'd lost that particular faith somewhere around the time her uncle's lawyer had explained what the papers she'd signed actually meant. But she thought that sometimes people made choices, small ones, unheroic ones, the choice to answer a door or stay in a barn until a horse stood up. And those choices accumulated into something neither person had planned. That was different from fate. It was better, actually. It meant something had been chosen. A year later, when the bay mare foaled in the early morning and Sarah was there in the barn at 4 a.m., and James came out with coffee and found her watching the foal try its legs. For the first time, he said the same thing he'd said the night they'd met. You're here, he said, not surprised exactly, just acknowledging it. I'm here, she said. The foal got its legs under it, stumbled, caught itself, and stood. I think about the bay mare a lot. The way she was lying on her side that first night, legs moving like she'd forgotten what standing felt like. I think about how close James came to losing her, and how close I came to not being there at all. There's a version of that night where I keep driving, or where I knock and nobody answers and I go back to the highway and wait out the storm in my truck. There's a version where I stay 2 days, fix what I can, and leave before anyone asks me anything I don't want to answer. I was good at leaving by then. I'd had practice. What I've come to understand is that the choices that change things are almost never the big dramatic ones. They're the small ones you barely register making. James answering the door when he was tired of strangers. Me going out to the barn because a sound bothered me. Those 2 things. That's the whole chain. But what I also understand now, and this took me longer, is that small choices aren't enough on their own. What you do after you make them is what actually determines where you end up. When Renata started digging into my past, I had a choice about who I was going to be in response to that. The version of me from a few years earlier would have run the numbers, decided I was making things worse for James, and disappeared before sunrise. I would have told myself it was the right thing to do. Protecting him. Being reasonable. I know now that was just fear wearing a practical coat. What I did instead was harder. I told James the truth about Daniel and my uncle's property. All of it. The parts that made me look careless, and the parts that made me look like someone who'd been taken advantage of, and the parts where the line between those 2 things was genuinely blurry. I told him before Renata could tell him her version. That's not nothing. That's a choice that required something. And then when I understood what Renata was doing, the bank pressure, the coordinated gossip, the steady erosion of James's ability to hold on to what he'd built, I didn't just wait for it to resolve itself. I sat at that kitchen table at 5 a.m, and I thought hard about what could actually be done. Not just what was comfortable or what kept me out of the line of fire, but what was true and what was provable, and what a person with a functioning mind could put together from the pieces available. That mattered. Thinking clearly when you're scared and tired, and someone with more resources than you is trying to make you feel small. That matters enormously. Frank Holt showing up was not an accident. Exactly, it was a consequence. He came because something in how James and I had handled ourselves had made it possible for him to come. Sometimes doing the right thing quietly creates the conditions for other people to do the right thing out loud. I didn't set out to build a life in that valley. I set out to get through the winter. But I think that's how most of the things worth having actually start. Not as decisions, but as small acts of basic decency, repeated until they become something real. The mare foaled in the spring. Sarah was there at 4 in the morning because of course she was. That's the thing about showing up. Once you start, it gets harder to stop.